I gotta say, I have to have heard this about a million times, and I'm sure you have too, that when the 90s grunge movement came along in the early 90s, that it destroyed and killed glam metal of the 80s. And though it probably seemed so initially, in the moment, but I find myself today wondering, how the hell do people believe that to be true? What is going on, everybody? Welcome back, music lovers, especially my rock music lovers. You know, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do so right now. Hit that subscribe button. That will absolutely help me grow. It'll help this channel grow. And we continue to be, well, one day I'll be able to explain where we started at, those that have been there with me, which quite a few of you have since the beginning. As this thing's growing slowly, I want to be able to look back one day and explain how I started, where I came from, and hopefully I will be able to grow in audience, in revenue, in equipment, and everything that comes with it. And I'd like to take you all along for the ride, and hopefully you'll be one of those that can look back and say, man, I remember when that channel was there. Look at where it's at now. But anyway, back to the debate. I mean, did 90s grunge really kill 80s glam and hair metal? You know what? I love being able to talk about this today, and I hope you'll help me. So please, anything you got to say, drop in the comment section, because I know this thing, if you're my age or older, man, this, I gotta say, was probably one of the most ignorant things I've ever heard in rock music. The fact that people still say it today. So when you really want to start talking about the origins of that 80s glam metal, a lot of people will want to revert back to bands like Motley Crue, Hanoi Rocks, Quiet Riot, Rat. Some people even throw Bon Jovi in there. And you know what? That is kind of the beginning of what it would eventually turn into in the 80s. And when we all say glam metal, that's the picture we get in our mind, is what the bands look like in the 80s. If you really want to go back further, I think that seed was planted in the early 70s. 70s, mid-70s, because Mark Bolan, the lead singer of the band T-Rex, this is a British band, and they were performing on a BBC show that used to be called Top of the Pops. Now on this show, Mr. Bolan would come out with glitter and satin. He was wearing exactly what you would imagine, well, what we would come to imagine from a glam metal band. But this was 1971, so it was kind of new, a lot different, but this was a man expressing himself, and as he performed their song Hot Love on this show, it definitely drew some attention. And if you're going to be in the entertainment business, you can have talent, but there's nothing wrong with trying to draw a little attention. Now, if you want to continue to stay in the 70s, we can think of that glam look, not necessarily the sound we would come accustomed to in the 80s, but that look. Well, you think of artists, British artists like David Bowie, Slade, Mud, Mott the Hoppy, Gary Glitter. They all had that look, and that was where the foundation started. I firmly believe that if you go back and look at it, you think about stuff from the 60s, it didn't really start to generate till the early 70s. And those artists out of the UK really started to set that foundation for that eccentric, vibrant, outgoing look. And then you start thinking about artists in the States. I think of Iggy Pop, the New York Dolls. They really started to put that, oh, I got one more. It just popped in my head. I didn't have this on my list, but Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper was absolutely insane. So think about that. When you think of Cooper, the New York Dolls, Iggy Pop, they started to somewhat integrate that style, but with a much harder sound. So now we're starting to get along that way, along that path, to those bands where they can really draw inspiration from combining the two. And that's what we would come to know and love when it came to 80s glam metal. Now, before we could actually give birth to what we would believe 80s glam metal to be in the 80s, go back to two bands I talked about earlier. The band Slade and Mott the Hoppy. If you really want to talk about that harder style starting to be integrated, those bands had great guitar riffs, and they had that eccentric style, and they were able to get the audience participation at a very high level. You think about those 80s glam metal bands. They were all about the crowd, hyping them up, getting them rowdy, absolutely having them fall in love with them. And the guitar was a huge part of 80s glam metal, no doubt. How many songs do not have a crazy guitar solo or two crazy guitar solos and a badass bridge? I almost test you to tell me one. I'd be hard pressed to find one out there, whether it was a beautiful ballad or just a crazy party song. no matter what, it's going to be hard to find. There might be one out there. If you can find one, please drop it in the comment section. I'd love to go listen to it, but I guarantee you're not going to find one. Now, like I said, those two bands out of the UK really started to develop that sound along with that style. You know, that would slowly start to bleed over into the States. Now, we already had those bands that I named earlier, the New York Dolls. We had Alice Cooper. We had Iggy Pop. You can even throw Kiss in there, because Kiss with the makeup, the outstanding performances on stage, those bands all set the foundation in the 70s. So now, as we roll into 1980, that is when glam metal as we know it would start to be born. As we rolled into the 80s, a lot of people give credit to Los Angeles and everything that was going on the Sunset Strip in the 80s, which rightly so. It was a big movement because people were coming from all over the country to get down there to try to get their bands signed and noticed. So not every band came from LA, and not everybody in those bands came from LA, but a lot of them will claim Los Angeles as their home because of, well, what it brought them. Now in the early 80s, you had bands like Quiet Riot, Wasp, Twisted Sister, Motley Crue. Those are some of the big four that really had that look and that hard sound to go with it. Now, Quiet Riot gets a lot of credit because they came onto the Sunset Strip and they get recognized as one of the first bands to start that movement, to get signed, have that sound that would eventually evolve into what those other bands did moving forward. But you really look at like Twisted Sister. Now, their style and their gimmick, to say, was pretty much meant to be like a drag queen. Just kind of like what the New York Dolls did, but a little bit of a different sound. Now, that was more gimmicky and meant to poke fun. Now, when I look at Motley Crue, they were wearing the makeup, but trying to give it a more masculine look, if you can, with a guy wearing makeup, which I think they did pretty damn good. Now, as you rolled in a little further, you would start to get bands like Poison. Now, Poison, they put that makeup on, and I'll be honest with you, if you didn't look twice, you might think for a second you were looking at a female. So they did their look, I don't know, somewhat to look pretty. I'll put Wasp in the Motley Crue category though. Definitely, they had the big hair, they had light makeup, and a kick-ass sound. But as we move forward, I think there's one band that really kind of integrated what 80s hair metal was and 90s grunge, and that's the band Guns N' Roses. They really had a style that said, okay, we're not going to wear makeup, we're going to look like a rock and roll band, but they drew it down. A lot of black, a lot of leather, big hair, but I think they bridged the two styles. But as that was going on with Guns N' Roses, because they came on in the late 80s, that little seed was already starting to sprout underground for that 90s grunge movement. So before we would actually roll into the 90s and that little seed of the grunge movement would start to sprout, you had Guns N' Roses kind of bridging that sound going into the new decade. But that didn't matter. Let's think about two things. If you ever had a handbook that said, this is a glam metal band from the 80s, wouldn't be a lot on there. I think what would be on there is a bunch of guys with big hair, some makeup, badass sound, badass guitarist, awesome songs you could throw on at any party, and a badass ballad. That's pretty much what an 80s glam metal was, and pretty much every band in that decade replicated that list to a T. But it was awesome, and we knew if a new band came on the scene, we were going to get some awesome songs, and it was going to be followed up with a ballad. I think of bands like Motley Crue, Home Sweet Home, Guns N' Roses. If you want to call Sweet Child of Mine a ballad, I won't, but a lot of people do. Cinderella, Don't Know What You Got Till It's Gone. And my favorite ballad, I think it's one of the best. You can poke fun, but if you really listen to it, this is not just a band trying to throw out a ballad. This is a band that threw out a piece of poetry. Lead singer Bret Michaels, when he wrote Every Rose Has Its Thorn in a laundromat in Dallas, Texas, after realizing his stripper girlfriend had cheated on him, even though she says she did it because he was cheating on her, doesn't matter. That's a piece of art. That's beautiful lyrics, beautiful song that still gets played and loved today. But that was your 80s glam metal movement. A bunch of guys wearing makeup, and you'd probably be embarrassed if you poked fun and they kicked your ass because they could do it with makeup. But up in the northwest of our country, specifically the state of Washington, Seattle, the city, there was a sound being born there in the late 80s that was about to explode. So up in the Pacific Northwest in the late 80s, you had some bands that were absolutely loved, and their sound was loved, and the music industry was starting to take notice because a little record label up there called Sub Pop Records was getting a lot of these bands bands like Green River, Mudhoney, Mother Love Bone, Soundgarden, and even though they weren't from the Seattle area, they pretty much are so connected to there as if they were, because the bands up there loved them, the fans up there loved them, and that's the band, the Melvins. So these bands in the late 80s were setting that foundation, they were setting that style, they were setting that sound, and it was about to literally explode so big that, well, that's why we say that 80s glam metal was killed by it, because literally it was like a solar eclipse. It just blocked out that entire decade. Now, the band Green River, I give a lot of respect to, and I consider them one of the biggest foundational pieces for the grunge movement of the 90s. Now, it was a short-lived band, but they would eventually spawn future members of Pearl Jam, Mother Love Bone, and Temple of the Dog. Mother Love Bone being an amazing band. Now, if you talk about the grunge movement, there will be hardcore fans of that movement, of the Pacific Northwest, Seattle area, that grew up in that time, that will tell you very quickly if you neglect to mention Mother Love Bone with some of the greatest bands that came out of that time. Now, their lead singer, Andrew Wood, an awesome performer, great stage presence, awesome frontman. He died young from a heroin overdose. Now, that really, well, it killed the band, but it didn't kill the movement altogether. That band, I think, would have been huge. Now, obviously, Green River was not part of the huge success that would be involved with any of those bands that were there when that movement exploded. But, again, a foundational piece, to say the least. Now, that movement would not have been anything if it wasn't for Sub Pop Records. That small label up in Seattle brought in all these bands. They showed a lot of love to them. I mean, they believed in them, they gave them the tools they needed to succeed, and if they would go on, which they all did, to sign with much larger labels to become much more successful, they were more than happy to see that happen. And a lot of respect needs to go to Sub Pop Records for this movement as well. And anybody that talks about the grunge movement, I guarantee any video you go watch, Sub Pop Records will be mentioned in that video. So now we'll jump into that explosion of the grunge movement. Okay, you cannot mention the grunge movement without mentioning Nirvana. That's just, there's no way around it, period. They were the reason that thing exploded. And it's not just because of them, but they were the ones that were putting that spotlight and got it rolling. Now, their first album, their debut album, Bleach, was released through Sub Pop Records. I've said this before in other videos, and I'm sure you already know that if you're a rock and roll fan. When they signed with DGC Records, which is an extension of Geffen Records, they got in the studio with a new drummer, Dave Grohl, we know that. They got in the studio with producer Butch Vig, one of the most amazing, iconic producers in the music industry, and they recorded Nevermind. We know the story. Smells Like Teen Spirit, hit radio airwaves across the world, and as they say, the rest is history. But I got a couple ideas of why that happened. That was the start of it. That was the explosion. Now we got to ask ourselves, why? So one thing I've been very adamant about my whole life since I've gotten a little older and just been a huge music fan, rock music fan, that the grunge movement was obviously Nirvana starting it off. They got the whole thing in motion, but I've said it, it's the music industry that made it blow up the way it did. And they can do whatever they want. If right now they have a new sound or some new style of bands, a group of bands that they want to just put out there as the new big thing, they're going to put it out there. They're going to produce the music. They're going to make sure it sounds good. It's radio friendly. It's got everything it needs to be a hit, not just the talent behind the artists and their musical abilities. They're going to put their abilities to work, and they're going to make it big. They're going to shove it down your throats. They're going to make it seem like it's the greatest thing in the world, and 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to succeed. And that's what they did with all these bands out of Seattle. They made sure they put them out there to the right people at the right time, and they definitely promoted it very well. Now, you listen to Nevermind if it was produced by Sub Pop Records. I've said it before. I do not think everything would sound exactly the same as it did being produced by DGC. And I think that's the biggest thing. Nirvana's talented. Amazing freaking album. Kurt Cobain, one of the greatest songwriters of all time. I'm not saying he's the greatest, but he is a damn good songwriter. You put all that together with a very deep-pocketed record company, they're going to make it happen. And then, obviously, you bring on Alice in Chains. You bring Soundgarden in, who's been there from the beginning, and then Pearl Jam shows up. I mean, these four, the godfathers of the grunge movement, they just exploded. And the record companies made sure that it happened. Now, Janie Lane from Warrant. He said he walked into Columbia Records not long after Cherry Pie had been released and was a huge hit. They had the big Warrant poster on the wall. He said the next time he came back to Columbia Records, he looked up where that poster used to be and he saw a poster of Alice in Chains. He said it wasn't that long in between visits. He said he knew right then and there. He had that feeling. And he said, well, I guess it's over for us. But let's go back and revisit this whole grunge killed 80s glam metal. We know that's not true. We know what the 90s grunge movement did was change pop culture, and it did change it. And it would not go back to what it was in the 80s. Not just for 80s glam metal, for a lot of things. The 90s changed a lot. The way we did movies, the way we did commercials, the way we did TV shows, and then obviously the way we did music. So yes, there was a big shift in pop culture from one decade to another. Nothing wrong with that, because I think both decades were awesome. I mean, you got the 80s, the neon decade, and then you got the 90s, which was full of awesome stuff. And again, I consider it the last great decade, my opinion. But no, it didn't. I mean, those 80s glam metal bands, those hair metal bands, most of them, the big ones, they're still alive and well, kicking ass. And it's never changed. You look at even movies and TV shows today, they still play their music. The radio still plays their songs. Same thing with the 90s grunge movement. And in fact, it didn't last as long. At least it didn't have as big of a heyday as the 80s glam hair metal bands. To me, it always reminds me of young kid gets a new toy. And that toy he loved, the older toy that he's had for years. He throws it in the toy box and it just gets buried. Eventually, that new toy, he gets bored with it and realizes, well, this ain't as much fun as I thought it was going to be. And he goes digging for that old toy. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that new toy. But it had its moment. It was the next big thing. But in the end, you want to go back to what you knew you loved before. Because they're both great. Same thing with all those bands that came out of Seattle, Washington, and the other bands that were linked with them, even from other parts of the country. They were great bands, and they brought us some great albums, just like the bands from the 80s. We got great stuff from both of them. We should be fortunate that we got both of those eras. They were both amazing, something we can look back on fondly and remember, man, I remember when that was going on, and I remember when I was doing when that was going on. Sorry, stumbled over my words. You know what I mean, right? They were both great. One didn't kill the other. One just, its time was over. And the other ones had just begun. And then eventually, its time ended. It's always going to be the circle of life, man. Something new is going to come on and take over. But that doesn't take anything away from what was. So yeah, they didn't kill it. They just took over for a moment. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. This has been a blast. So please drop in the comment section what you think of that whole concept that they killed the 80s glam metal bands. Let me know what you think. Anyway, thanks for watching. Till next time, go out there, take care of yourself, your friends, your family. Do something amazing. Be the next big thing at whatever you want to be the next big thing at. You can do it. Till next time, take care of yourself. I'm out.